home economics is basically what it is, really getting down and dirty with your food supply, learning to store foods, what foods you need to buy, what foods you shouldn't buy, and then mixing those ingredients with long-term foods to make, a culinary arsenal, I call it. So, one thing that people won't find in the course, there's about, 15, 20 videos on freeze-dried foods, but those are the things we want to they last 25 years. You talk about some of that kind of stuff. We want to leave that stuff in our pantry, but we want to be using things that are easy to get: oats, wheat, corn, rice, canned foods, and mixing those with garden fresh ingredients.
Apple recently released a long-awaited privacy feature that prevents you from being tracked across websites. Facebook relied on tracking more than any other business. So it's no surprise they're trying to change this. Apple users now have the ability to choose whether or not they want to be tracked. Opting out will prevent their data from being used for ultra-targeted ads, such as age, location, health information, and your browsing history. While this is a step in the right direction, this new feature won't completely protect you online. To do that, you'll need a VPN. You can head over to virtualshield.com, and in the download tab, I'm going to choose Firefox. And click Install Now to add the Virtual Shield add-on. It's just that easy. And get started with your free 30-day trial. Install it, click Connect. You'll see the shield turn from red to green. And you'll see how from my initial service provider, I was able to even change my IP. Virtual Shield Network protected. Try Virtual Shield risk-free for 30 days and another 30-day money-back guarantee by visiting virtualshield.com/adapt2030 and get 30% off for life by taking advantage of this custom deal. That link's in the description box below. And now on with the video. And good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Special guest, Kevin Snow, Chef Kevin Snow, as a matter of fact. A lot of the things I talk about, crop losses here, economic reductions over there, but today it's going to be more about what we can do about it. So we're going to talk about harvest eating, and Chef Keith Snow has the Harvest Eating YouTube channel. Also, if you go back and look at some of the prior videos there, had a television series of harvest eating, and then also right over on harvesteating.com, talking about regenerative agriculture, growing your own local food, consuming your own local food from your gardens, from community gardens, those around you, so that distance to the plate from where it's produced is minimized. Today's talk is going to be all about how to store foods for a longer amount of time, because right now, things are bountiful in the harvest. If you go to farmers co-ops, you're going to find every bin's full. Bulk buying, I buy from the Amish down the road over here, and they had 5 ears of corn for $15, sweet corn. They had 15 pounds of green beans for $15, but that's in a bulk. So wherever you go right now is the best time to buy foods. And then think about the seasonality of the foods. It's going to switch over to fruits later on. From the present fruits that we have with apricots and different types of summer berries, which we need to store those up, but then we're going to switch over to the apples, the pumpkins, and you can get that full year round. So probably, I'm going to say 6 months of the year, you don't have access to, very fresh foods. So you're going to have to store that. And I am trying to learn the best I can here. I'm happy Keith is joining me because I am here to learn. And I'm really hoping that today's talk is going to give you some very solid information that you can share with your friends, your families, help you save money, help you have a healthier, diet moving through. I know canned foods have a lot of sodium, and I store food as well, but I like to mix fresh in when I have a chance. And this is what it's all about today. Storing the foods, being able to take what you have in different ways, fashions, and forms, and keep it up. Most people would say freeze it. Well, how big is your freezer really? Unless you're buying a new chest freezer or something, and that'll get full pretty quick as well. Refrigerator only has so many cubic feet in it, so where do you go from there? Glass jars, vacuum sealed, I don't know. These are some of the easy ones that I can ping on dehydrating, but there's a plethora of others which Keith is going to share with us today. So Keith, Chef Keith Snow, I do appreciate you joining me today, and thanks so much for spending your time. We had a really good conversation yesterday about what we see moving into the future, food pricing, and we can get into some of that with supermarkets stockpiling for shortages. Writing's on the wall, and from a personal viewpoint, if you haven't seen something's changed by now, I don't think you ever are going to. Or those who haven't seen the change yet are not going to until they're standing in a food line somewhere. But that's where we don't want to be. We want to be able to store our own, grow our own, trade our own with others. So Keith, welcome. Floor is yours.
Well, David, thanks a lot for having me. I appreciate it. And just want to say hey to all your listeners and followers out there. And thank you for the work you do. Certainly, it's been eye-opening for me. And I've been in this food space for a long, long time. I started when I was 14 years old in kitchens, and stayed in the food business for 30 plus years. I've got French culinary training, and I've served in some really big chef positions through the years. And then I found myself living on a farm in North Carolina. And one of the questions that always sort of nagged at me was, if you're a chef or a sculptor or an artist, everybody wants to know what your specialty is. And I cook all types of food, but I never really had something that I would call a specialty. I mean, a lot of chefs will say, oh, it's French food, it's Asian fusion. I mean, it could be any number of things. But when I landed on that farm in North Carolina and started gardening and growing food and making connections with farmers, because I grew up in a farm family, a dairy family in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, I quickly learned that seasonal cooking, farm to table stuff was what I was most passionate about. And when I started making TV shows, it was with PBS, and we did some pilots for the Food Network, but never succeeded in getting any of those on the air. So I turned to the internet and YouTube, and I was one of the first 100 partners on YouTube. So we made a lot of video content. Eventually, we put up harvesteating.com and started working with CSAs and local farmers to promote their stuff. And I was one of the founding members of Slow Food in Greenville, South Carolina, which is an organization that connects people to the source of their food. During that time, I was working with Whole Foods, and we were filming segments in their store. And eventually, the Harvest Eating TV show appeared on a pretty obscure network. It's actually in your home state there in Tennessee. It's called RFD TV. They're based out of Nashville. So we had a 2-year run on that network where we produced 20 full episodes, and we traveled all around the country. And the purpose was to show people doing great things in the food space, everything from crab farmers in the Gulf Coast of Florida to asparagus growers in North Carolina, dairy people, everything in between. So each show would have a location segment, and then we'd meet the farmers, and then eventually wind up in the studio kitchen where I would show people how to cook with the foods. So the point you just made earlier about seasonal food and sourcing food, that's been something that I've been focused on since 2005. And during that time, the big sort of diet in the industry was the Atkins diet. So a lot of people were doing low carb, and farm to table really wasn't a big thing. Most recently, I just served as a food and beverage director for a major ski resort in Sundance, called Sundance in northern Utah. Robert Redford used to own that property. And we had several restaurants where we sourced a lot of local foods. We grew some foods in the garden. But my work as a chef has taken me, to North Carolina and Colorado, also at ski resorts. So the training is varied, but the thing that I really like to focus on is the seasonal cooking. And in the last few years, since the 2008 real estate and banking collapse, I have focused quite a bit on making my family a little more food secure. So we started food, and on our farm, we produced as much as we could. And we were also really big at visiting farm markers and markets and CSAs and any place that we could get food, picking food. We would go every year during specific harvests like strawberries and peaches and blueberries, whatever we could, apples, and we would find ways to store those ingredients. So I've been doing a lot of that since 2008. Of course, recently you start to see what's going on with some of the weather patterns and some of the crops that are not doing so well. And so I've amped up a lot of that storage. Now, part of my work in the media is to serve on a show called the Survival Podcast, which is a really big show, gets over, I think, 200,000 downloads a day. And I'm their panel chef. So I've been fielding questions from that audience since 2011. And I guess it was about 2015, 16, a lot of the call-in questions that I would field were about how do I cook with stored foods? Because people were, I think they bought a lot of stored foods. They were on the internet, they got a little panicked about the financial system, so they bought a lot of foods. And then after a few years, they were wanting to know what to cook with them. And it was getting to the point where I was tired of answering those questions because they just kept coming. So eventually I thought, hey, wait a minute, the light bulb went off in my head. If people are this concerned about cooking, with cans of beans and rice and wheat and oats and corn, whatever they were storing, freeze-dried foods, dehydrated foods, maybe there'd be some value in me diving into it. And I'm used to cooking with fresh foods and sort of exotic ingredients. And we had probably spent over $2,000 a month with my family on food. That was our food budget. My kids have grown up very fortunate with the foods they've been able to eat. So I thought I needed to go into the pantry and stop going to the store and see, how this actually would work for us. So I believe it was 2016, April. I didn't go to the store. I just used what we had around in the garden, farm markets, our canned foods. And I started cooking recipes for the family to see how they would respond. And everybody really enjoyed the foods. So after that 30-day period, I set off on a pretty long amount of time producing videos and writing this course. I've got a writing partner up in Montana. He's a much better writer than I am. So most of the written material that go on the Food Storage Feast course, he did. And then all the recipe development and video work using my skills in the past with TV production, I did, but there was a change. Most of my TV work was on camera and, a 2-camera shoot and just more complicated. And what I didn't want was, the chef's personality to get in the way or the locations. I just wanted the food to be the star. So on the Food Storage Feast videos, it's usually from the elbows down with close-ups of the food, showing people exactly how to use these ingredients. So that took a long time to build. We launched that, I think it was January of 2018, and we've had really good success with it. And a lot of people have become students of the course. And what's neat for me is I can look inside. It's hosted on an online learning platform. So I can see who's online at any one time, what videos they watch, what recipes they download. So people come back over and over again to use the recipes and the resources that are in the course. So what I'm interested now is really kind of sounding the alarm for people, because they don't realize how bad some of the harvests are around the globe. They are starting to see that inflation is getting there and the cost of foods are really going up. And this may not be a problem for wealthy people. They might not even notice it. But if you've got a family and kids, you're going to notice your grocery bill really skyrocketing. So the things that you're talking about, finding local sources, home economics is basically what it is, really getting down and dirty with your food supply, learning to store foods, what foods you need to buy, what foods you shouldn't buy, and then mixing those ingredients with long-term foods to make, a culinary arsenal, I call it. So, one thing that people won't find in the course, there's about, 15, 20 videos on freeze-dried foods, but those are the things we want to they last 25 years. You talk about some of that kind of stuff. We want to leave that stuff in our pantry, but we want to be using things that are easy to get: oats, wheat, corn, rice, canned foods, and mixing those with garden fresh ingredients, things that we can source locally. When we chatted the other day, I mentioned where I am in southern Utah, we've got abundant apricot orchards. So I took my family out there, and there wasn't a soul out there, and we were picking, we probably picked 100 pounds of apricots in 30 minutes. So we took those home and We dried a good portion of those in our Excalibur food dehydrator, and then we made some jam with the rest of those. So that food's been, we enjoyed certainly plenty of it fresh, but it's been put up and we can use it down the road.
Keith, can I stop for a second? Because you mentioned back in the, when you were talking about where you could find the CSA, for those who don't know, could you explain what that is? Because
Sure.
then you're on the self-picking, farms that are real popular right now. The most famous would be, fruits, mainly blueberries and different kind of tree-based fruits. But CSA, can you explain that for others who are going to go right into this self-picking, self-crop type of farming?
Yeah, sure. So CSA stands for Community Sustainable Agriculture, and there's several formats of CSAs, but it's usually when you're partnering with the grower or farmer. Sometimes it's at the beginning of the season where they'll ask you to make regular monthly payments to them, and then each week you'll go to either the farm to pick it up or a delivery area. Some of them are more complicated than others, and then you'll get a share of the harvest throughout the growing season. And you can find a lot of CSAs by visiting a website. It's called localharvest.org. And there are farms and markets listed. There's tens of thousands of them listed around the country. And it's a good point that you mentioned. That's one of the reasons I started Harvest Eating, was when people were visiting and joining these CSAs, they're getting baskets of food and they're panicking. So they would go on the internet, what the heck is kohlrabi, or how do I cook with a turnip, or, wild greens and all that. So that's when they started to really find the Harvest Eating content. This is 2005, 6, 7, 8. So I started to tailor a lot of my content around teaching people to use those foods. But there is a lot of food out there if you just look for it.
Yeah, now let me throw a point in there for you, because you mentioned the deep leafy greens. Now, from my own personal research, going back through these last 6 grand solar minimums back to, I'd say, solidly 2,400 years ago, 400 BC, they call it the Homeric minimum. What you find in these grand solar minimums, or you always get the economic destruction and reset, and the government's changed structure, and that's fine. But the population migration was kind of a dual fold purpose that people left. They couldn't find living or work, and it became so difficult to grow food that they had lack of foods. They moved to other areas. But one thing that kept recurring again and again and again in stories through the last 2,000 years, micronutrients, vitamins, and minerals were lacking, and that's the reason that people started to get malnourished, sick, cognitively impaired, physically impaired, the amount of work that they could do. So a lot of people are in the same, they're trying to equate today's workload with when you're going to be eating half the amount of calories or getting half the vitamins or nutrients. Your workload's not going to be able to sustain for a full 8-hour workday on the farm if you're only eating, or I should say in the city, if you're on rations. You're not going to be able to work the way you did. And these are the routine things that kept coming up again and again. And what it boiled down to, no pun intended, was lack of micronutrients and minerals in the body. Now, when you talked about the leafy greens, that's what got me onto it, because even during the wintertime, here in Tennessee, those mustard greens will still grow. I know they're a little bitter. There's a million ways to cook mustard greens. It's part of the Southern traditions down here. But that's where you're going to get an enormous amount of vitamins. The darker the green on the leaf, the more nutrients, micronutrients in there, especially the vitamins. And that was the number one thing that kept recurring. So if you wanted to talk to that, about the vitamin mineral content of the food that you're going to need to take into consideration as well, and some things that you could grow through the winter that'll still provide you with some of these vitamins.
Those are some of the most nutrient-dense crops out there, some of these leafy greens. And growing up a Yankee from New Jersey, I don't think I saw kale until I was 21 years old, so it wasn't really a popular thing for me. But knowing the food culture in the South, having spent 10, 15 years in the Carolinas, that is a really important crop. And some of those cold hardy things can really do well. I mean, they can grow right through frost. And we've had cabbages, greens, all types of things like that go through some serious hard frost, even a light freeze, and we still got harvest from them. So those are foods that people, maybe they're not used to eating them, but they really should investigate these things, because they do have a lot of nutrition packed in them. They can be easier to grow. Also, some of the high quality dairy ingredients. You know, when you talk about vitamins, fat-soluble vitamins, good raw dairy, yogurt, these are things that have a lot of nutrition in them. And, you know, touching on the regenerative agriculture side of things, if you're buying foods just from the supermarket, you know, a little factoid is California supplies like 80%, 75, 80% of the fruit and nuts in this country. And I have European in-laws, and they've got very good fruit in Europe, and I've traveled extensively in Europe and France, filming TV shows and all that, and the fruit and the quality of the fruit there, it's so much better than the stuff you find in the supermarket, because most of these crops that are mass grown in the central valleys of California and places like that, they're not really grown for the nutritional content. They're grown for their ability to store and ship. And most of the fruits are picked completely not ripe. And yeah, eventually they'll change color, but when you pick something off the vine, it loses its connection. It's kind of like a baby and the umbilical cord. I mean, that's where the food is coming from, the vine, the nutrition from the ground. And when you cut that off, yeah, it's going to eventually ripen. And a lot of times they'll put them in a special room, and they use modified atmospheric pressure, like they pump different gases in there to make the food ripen. But the taste is just not there, nor is the vitamin and mineral content. And the fields at these major grow regions, they are not using regenerative agriculture. They're growing monocrops, they're spraying them a lot, and they're just not, the nutritional value is maybe 45% of what it used to be a few decades ago. So if you're eating just from the store, you're going to be missing a lot of nutrients. But when you start to find farmers markets and CSAs and grow things in your own yard, you're typically dealing with smaller people that care a lot more about the soil. And basically the soil, it's not just dirt, it's serious, there's serious things happening below the surface of the ground that most people just don't comprehend. And trust me, I've worked my way up as a gardener, thinking that you just plant into the red clay in North Carolina, and yeah, something comes up, but and you know, over in Tennessee, this red clay is, it's atrocious stuff to grow in, and that it takes years using regenerative methods and mixing in animals on the pasture, on the property, to build diversity under the soil. Because if you don't have rain infiltration, if you don't have soil microbes, if you don't have all these fungus networks that grow, and if you're tilling the soil like these Central Valley farmers do, once you till the soil, you destroy those networks. So the plants will not grow unless you're using chemical applications. And these places where they get the NPK, a lot of it, there's only a few states. Tennessee has a few, there's quite a bit in Florida. And, you know, to use the word raping the earth, I mean, that's just, it's amazing how they harvest these petrochemicals to make fertilizer, and then the farmer just sprays it on the crop year after year. It is bad for the environment in every way you look at it. So you really need to be sourcing better food. And your point, you go buy some greens in the store compared to what you could get at a farmer's market, and you take that to a lab and you test the nutrition, you'll be very surprised how different it really is.
Yeah, and I'll go on with that too, because, you know, my pear, plum, and plum cot trees got ripped to shreds by Japanese beetles this year. But I use soap and water, and I'll go out there every 2 or 3 days, because I don't want to spray my trees, because that's going into the soil and I'm going to be eating that eventually. Same with the apple trees. They got some cedar rust. So what did I do? I went and bought some copper. I wanted to treat things as naturally as I could. Sure, I could get all types of fungicides and get up in the trees and whatnot, but that's not what I want in my ecosystem. And, you know, speaking of the soil, we do have the red clay out here. And just today, before we got on our call here, we're down at the hardware store getting something called Soil Builder. It's like mulch that has broken down for another 8-9 months, where it's really just almost, I wouldn't say silk thread, but getting close between that really old mulch that's broken down into almost a powder, barely a step above that. Then we mix that in the garden bed, but we also use mycorrhiza with kelp, because you can buy a 50 or 100 pound bag of organic kelp. You know, if you're looking at algae, and this is what we did when we planted our trees too, in the holes, we put, it was an oyster shell, we put in mycorrhiza, a little bit of peat moss, all those same things, the kelp and everything to try to supercharge those roots and get that whole fungal network down. And at the same time, I'm working with a couple guys who are combining biochar and beam together to make a single product that, again, you dissolve in water and then spray over, and it helps that microbial network develop even further. Fully natural. I'm trying to go as far away from pesticides as I can. A couple reasons. The first one is obviously your health. And, if you're going to be spraying that around, I raise bees. I don't want my bees killed off by any types of pesticides. Bees are expensive. They're difficult to keep anyway. And if I have a couple good hives, and I definitely do not want to interfere with those. Bees travel a long way. So if you're spraying in the front yard and you go back, a couple thousand feet back on the other edge of the property back there, those bees are traveling up to the pond in front here. Secondly, what about the supply chains? The supply chains are not really, they're having a lot of difficulty. So if you're planning your entire edible, scheduling around being able to use petrochemicals to fend off pests, to give yourself that, boost. If you go 100%, I have some 45% phosphorus, and that's great because you could use it for a few things. But if you're going to be doing that all the time, every time, counting on that for your food production, what happens if the supply chain goes down? Like, we burn our own wood out here and we save all the charcoal. And then what I do is I put it in a big 55-gallon drum or some other, we were using a 32-gallon trash can, put the charcoal in there, fill it with water, and then add the mycorrhiza and then add the kelp in there and let it sit for like 2 weeks until that charcoal absorbs, and then just throw that in the field or in the beds with it. So I'm trying to get all these different types of ways to stay away from chemicals and go 100% natural, but get that microbial base in the soil as churning as it can naturally. And we had an old chicken coop out here, ended up scraping that out and just liberally throwing it around in different places. Even it's been broken down for a couple of years. It's a super old chicken coop out there. I'm the same way, trying to keep it as healthy ecosystem as possible without disturbing the very fiber of life that gives you your life in terms of vegetables and produce.
As you were talking, it reminded me when I was first starting to garden on our farm in North Carolina. I, of course, wanted to go the natural route, and I had, it was basically monocrop, like a bunch of tomatoes or single species plants, and they would get destroyed by the bugs. And then I'd watch my neighbor, and she had a tremendous harvest. She was a much older woman, but she would douse her plants with 7 dust. And this
I know that one.
It's been around forever. She would put it in an old, a tube sock, a big long tube sock, and then she'd just go in there banging it all around. There'd be white powder everywhere. And she would get a lot of harvest, but, you're thinking to yourself, well, is that stuff safe? Well, you can't harvest it within 7 days. So I'm like, well, it's got to be in the soil. The soil is uptaking into the plant, and vice versa. Whatever's on the plant winds up in the soil. It can't be good. And that really started me on a path to look at other ways. And then I would see farmers at some of these big orchards, and they would drag these things that look like a giant missile down each row of the orchard, and they'd be in white suits covered with their face was covered, goggles. They'd have big respirators on, spraying these chemicals all over these trees. And you just think to yourself, this can't be good. It can't be good. And then when you find other people that are doing it differently, for instance, out in I'm in Colorado as I record this interview, out in by Grand Junction. There's a place called Palisades, and they don't have much bug pressure at all. A combination of it's not very moist, a little bit of altitude, so a lot of the crops there are not sprayed, and you can taste the difference in the fruit. So this goes back to what you were saying about building the soil. We have to get away from monocrops in this country and in our gardens.